The Norfolk Library, Gilded or Golden? March 6th is the official birthday of the Norfolk Library as we know it today. A Victorian building designed by Hartford architect George Keller in 1888 and given to the town by Isabella Eldridge, the library opened its doors for the first time on March 6, 1889. However, unofficially, the Norfolk Library was in fact born 67 years earlier, in 1822. That Norfolk Library was a subscription library. It had a written constitution and bylaws, but it had no building. At that time, it was a traveling library. All the books were housed in an oak bookcase, built especially for that purpose, and the bookcase periodically traveled from house to house, the homeowner serving as temporary librarian. Among the custodians was Mr. Aaron Gilbert, a tailor who lived in an octagonal house. It was said that he dispensed books and clothes with equal cheerfulness. We don't have a picture of his house, but if you look closely at this map of Norfolk dated 1874, you will see the tailor's house. The red dot is where the library stands today across from the green. The arrow points to the octagonal house. The house was just opposite the old bank building, which is now next to Infinity Hall. All the houses that once stood on that side of Greenwoods Road are now gone, replaced with the brick wall that encloses the Steckel estate. You might wonder what an octagonal house looked like. Octagon houses were a unique style briefly popular in the 1850s. This house in Chelsea, Massachusetts, is an example of what Aaron Gilbert's house might have looked like. The tailor only had the Norfolk Library bookcase in his house for a few years before it moved on. The development of the collection of this early Norfolk Library was closely monitored by a committee of three. At one time, Isabella's mother, Sarah Eldridge, pictured here, was in charge of purchasing books. Isabella's father, the Reverend Joseph Eldridge, kept an impressive library of his own in the parsonage, pictured at left, now Battelle House, overlooking the village green. So with this background in librarianship, it was natural that Isabella would have thought to build a library as a suitable memorial for her parents after they died. But perhaps there was another reason she wanted to build a library. Article 9 of the Norfolk Library Constitution of 1822 reads, "Novels and romances shall not be purchased for the library." Perhaps Isabella chafed at the restriction, no novels and romances. She was, after all, 29 years old at the time of her mother's death, unmarried, and I am quite certain she was a romantic. A companion to Isabella in later life, Emily Hamont recalled that she enjoyed reading books that were considered at the time not quite fit for circulation, racy novels such as Galsworthy's Forsyte Saga. But whether or not Isabella read romances in 1888, I do know that the Norfolk Library would not have been designed the way it was were she not a romantic. She and the architect, George Keller, forged their own path in designing this library, flying in the face of Norfolk convention and family tradition. Let me explain. After the death of Isabella's parents, her uncle Robbins Battelle became patriarch of the family and advisor to Isabella and her four sisters. He lived in White House, pictured here in 1880. The decade of the 1880s saw a building campaign by members of the Eldridge and Battelle family. The interesting thing about all of these buildings, with the exception of the Norfolk Library, is that they were designed by the same architect, Josiah Cleveland Cady, a prominent New York-based architect. Robbins Battelle first brought Cady to Norfolk in 1880 to design an art gallery and library addition to White House. At the time, Cady was working on the design for the Metropolitan Opera House, pictured here, now demolished. He was best known for his institutional work and designed 15 buildings for Yale University, as well as buildings for Trinity College and Wesleyan University. In New York, he also designed the 77th Street facade of the American Museum of Natural History, pictured here when there were still elevated tracks on Columbus Avenue. The same year that Uncle Robbins added the art gallery to White House, Isabella and her sisters gave memorial stained glass windows to the Church of Christ in memory of their parents. Although the sisters selected the windows, made in Germany, it was Robbins who engaged Katie to design the architectural setting. 3 years later, in 1884, Robbins and his sister Anna Battelle built the Robbins School in memory of their grandfather, Reverend Ami Ruhama Robbins. Once again, it was Katie who designed the school buildings, pictured here. Finally, Battelle Chapel, built in 1887 by Robbins' sister, Urania Battelle Humphrey, in memory of their parents, Joseph and Sarah Battelle. The architect Katie, again responsible for the design. It seems that he was the architect of choice for the Eldridge and Battelle family. The following year, 1888, Isabella built the library. Robbins probably advised her that Katie should design the building. If Isabella had chosen Katie to design the Norfolk Library, it might have looked something like Battelle Chapel on the left, or the Scoville Library in Salisbury, pictured at the right. However, Isabella did something different. She turned to the Hartford architect George Keller for the design. Why? When Isabella chose Keller, he was a well-known architect. On the national front, he had recently won the competition to design the President Garfield Memorial in Cleveland, pictured at the right. Born in Ireland in 1842, he immigrated to this country as a youngster with his family during the potato famine. When he was 16, he found work as a draftsman for an architect, and during the Civil War worked in the Navy Yards designing war buildings. He came to Hartford to work for a firm designing cemetery monuments before opening his own office in 1872 at the age of 30. While the Garfield Memorial was under construction, Keller won the commission to design a Civil War monument in Hartford. The Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch at left boldly broke the conventional type of Civil War monument, usually a cylindrical column with a figure of winged victory on top, such as his Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Buffalo at the right. In contrast, the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch in Hartford was designed as a triumphal arch, the first in this country. Located in Bushnell Park, it was the gateway to the bridge which then spanned the Park River, now sadly buried. It was dedicated in 1886, 2 years before the Norfolk Library was built. In spite of his renown, Isabella's choice of Keller as architect was a bold one. He had no history in Norfolk, he had never designed a library, and his materials of choice, brownstone, fishtail shingles, and red tile, had not been used here before. To answer the question why she chose Keller, and to provide a context, let's look at some of the buildings that had been constructed in Hartford in the decade or so before the Norfolk Library was built. In the second half of the 19th century, Hartford was in its golden age, as reflected in these buildings. It was the capital of Connecticut and the wealthiest city in the country. Moving counterclockwise on the screen, we see that Hartford was at the forefront of culture, with the oldest museum in the country, the Wadsworth Athenaeum. At the forefront of education, with Trinity College, and of industry, with Samuel Colt's Armory. It was home to the literati of Nook Farm, including Mark Twain, whose house is at the upper right. Before settling in Hartford, Mark Twain visited the city in 1868 and wrote, "Of all the beautiful towns it has been my fortune to see, this is the chief." Perhaps the most architecturally significant building in Hartford at this time was designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, unquestionably one of the greatest 19th century American architects. Inspired by the cathedrals of medieval Europe and the vibrant architecture of Victorian Britain, Richardson revived a medieval style, using it to develop a unique personal idiom that came to be known as Richardson Romanesque. The Cheney Building is considered one of Richardson's best works, a classic example featuring the robust stonework and rounded arches typical of the architect. It was built in 1875 for the Cheney brothers, who owned a silk mill in Manchester. The ground floor provided retail space with offices and apartments above. It later housed the G. Fox and Company department store. The Cheney Building is one of a number of high Victorian buildings built in Hartford after the Civil War. The hallmark of this picturesque work is the structural use of color, reflected here in multicolored banded arches and varied brownstone. This is a detail featuring a gargoyle of a wolf and a salamander. Other high Victorian buildings erected in Hartford at this time include work by the architect Edward Tuckerman Potter. The Church of the Good Shepherd is an example. It was built in 1867 as a parish church for the workers at the Colt Armory, and the structural use of color is reflected in the banded arches and the slate tiles on the roof, clearly an important part of the design. The parish house for the Church of the Good Shepherd, also designed by Potter, matches the neighboring church in the use of banded arches and slate tiles. It was built as a memorial for Elizabeth Colt's son, Caldwell Hart Colt, a yachtsman who had died at sea in mysterious circumstances. Many of the decorative features of the building have a nautical theme, and some have suggested that the entire structure looks like a ship at sea, with the angular apse standing for the ship's prow. Such symbolism is typical of Victorian architecture. The house Mark Twain built, also designed by Potter, has been said to evoke a Mississippi River steamboat, its third-floor terrace the pilot house, its veranda the ship's deck, and the house poised to set sail. In Hartford, it was said that this house was neither mid-Elizabethan nor mid-Victorian, but wholly and absolutely Mark Twain. And perhaps it is reflective of the exuberant personality and lively, exaggerated wit of this famous author, with 3 largely non-functional eyebrow windows peeking out above the porch like eyes with long eyelashes. The house is typically Victorian, picturesque and colorful, with a variety of steep gables, dormers, chimneys, and windows. Surfaces vibrate with multicolored slate tiles on the roof and a variety of black and orange bands of brick. The veranda, terraces, and balconies each have different patterns of decorative stickwork, adding to the visual display. Victorian architecture is colorful and imaginative. To our eyes, perhaps excessive in the visual display, which brings me to the question I have posed. Are these buildings of Connecticut's Golden Age gilded or golden? The distinction is pertinent to Victorian architecture because we might think of this work as over the top, just as the term Gilded Age refers to the excesses of late Victorian America. It was, in fact, Mark Twain who coined the term Gilded Age. It was the title of a novel he wrote in 1873 with his neighbor Charles Dudley Warner, while the two were living in Hartford. The novel satirizes greed and corruption in post-Civil War America. Twain wrote the first 11 chapters, followed by 12 chapters written by Warner. The book was not considered a success by contemporary critics, who compared it to a badly mixed salad dressing in which the ingredients are capital, the use of them faulty. The authors may have turned to Shakespeare as a source for the word gilded. In his play King John, the Earl of Salisbury says, "To gild refined gold, to paint the lily, is wasteful and ridiculous excess." But while Victorian buildings are colorful and imaginative, this is not necessarily reflective of the conspicuous consumption of a Gilded Age. Mark Twain called his house bewitching. In Hartford, it was said that no one had ever seen anything like it before, nor ever would again. However, as unusual as it may seem, this Victorian house was shaped by the same forces that were reshaping American society in the 19th century. While this country was growing and diversifying, its cities expanding and its industry and technology changing, the American house literally burst out of its 18th century colonial box to answer 19th century needs. Two Norfolk houses provide an example. During the colonial years, American houses were built as part of the English tradition. A single basic form, the rectangular block, served for all houses, large and small. Here in Norfolk, we are very familiar with the type, illustrated by the Pettibone Tavern, now known as the Frog. Following the English lead during the Georgian era, American colonial houses were built according to classical principles of design, derived from Italian Renaissance architecture, principles such as balance, proportion, and symmetry, where the parts on either side of the center exactly correspond. In the 19th century, American architecture entered the Romantic era, moving away from classical reason and order toward feeling and imagination. The Romantic ideal was expressed in picturesque design, illustrated by the alders, now known as Manor House. Picturesque design is everything that classical design is not. It is characterized by irregularity, variety, intricacy, movement, and color. How did this happen? The Romantic mind embodies an important change in attitude toward architecture, a change that was due in part to the emerging science of archaeology. Following the publication of Stewart and Rivette's Antiquities of Athens and the discovery of Herculaneum and Pompeii in 1793, archaeology promoted a greater sense of history. Whereas before, architects had seen themselves as part of a long classical tradition, which began in ancient Rome and extended through the Renaissance to 18th century England, 19th century architects saw the past as a separate entity with many civilizations from which they could borrow. Style became a matter of choice, and architects looked to the civilizations of the past to express the dynamism and growing diversity of 19th century American life. This opened the door to the variety of styles that is a hallmark of picturesque Victorian architecture. Initially, the most popular style in Connecticut, as in the country at large following independence and the War of 1812, was the Greek Revival, based on the architecture of ancient Greece. At that time, Americans were searching for an appropriate way to express the ideal of democracy, and they found it in the Greek temple form, white and pristine, a symbol of the ancient Greek democracy. So they refashioned their buildings and houses as Greek temples. Alternatively, one might turn to Gothic architecture for an appropriate design for a museum, like the Wadsworth Athenaeum. Gothic revival was particularly well suited to express the educational mission of the Athenaeum, and indeed we find many colleges throughout the state with Gothic revival buildings. In addition to the many civilizations of the past, the untamed wilderness served as a source of inspiration for 19th century architects. Wild nature appealed to the Romantic mind and was glorified in the writings of Emerson and Thoreau, and in the work of artists such as Thomas Cole and Albert Bierstadt. Responding to the natural landscape, architects began to use color and picturesque features such as high roofs, steep gables, turrets, and towers. Richardson's work, seen here, is saturated with the colors of the American landscape, the deep reds, purples, and ochres found in our country's geology. Some of his work, such as the Ames Gate Lodge, evokes geology even more literally. Isabella probably began thinking about the design of her library just after George Keller's Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch in Bushnell Park was constructed in 1886. Undoubtedly, she knew about that monument, and she was most likely familiar with the high Victorian buildings that had risen in Hartford over the past decade, including Richardson's Cheney Building and George Keller's G. Fox Building next door, where she and her sisters may have shopped. But perhaps the most intriguing clue to Isabella's familiarity with Richardson is this book, Marianne Griswold von Rensselaer's seminal biography of the architect, published in 1888. Mrs. van Rensselaer, as she was known, was a personal friend of Richardson. A pioneering female architectural critic, she was part of New York's elite social and cultural circles and mingled with authors, artists, and affluent patrons of the arts. She met Richardson when she interviewed him and Frederick Law Olmsted for her Century Magazine series, Recent Architecture in America, in 1884. Richardson died prematurely 2 years later at the age of 48. And 2 years after that, Mrs. van Rensselaer's book was published in a limited edition of 500 copies. It propelled the architect into fame. We have a copy in the special collections of the Norfolk Library. It is not inscribed by Isabella, but it is number 73 in that first limited edition of 500 issued before the library was built. It must have been acquired soon after publication. I believe that it belonged to Isabella and her family. In it, she would have read about the 5 extraordinary libraries Richardson designed, which Mrs. van Rensselaer described as conspicuous among his best products. Marianne Griswold von Rensselaer was memorialized on this bronze relief sculpture by her friend, the artist Augustus St. Gaudens, in 1888. In a curious coming together of the strands of history, Marianne Griswold von Rensselaer was the aunt of George Griswold, who would later marry Isabella Eldridge's niece, Isabel Bridgman. Following the death of Isabella and her sister Alice Bridgman, the Griswolds would serve as successive presidents of the Norfolk Library until the 1960s. Richardson's career coincided with the rise of public education and the spread of interest in cultural development, leading to the creation of many small public libraries, such as the Norfolk Library, donated by patrons for the improvement of various New England towns. His 5 library designs, in his signature Romanesque style, evoked the hallowed halls of learning erected in the Middle Ages. Yet, although he drew from the past, He has been called the father of modern architecture in this country for his fluid floor plans and straightforward expression of structure and materials. While his library designs are now regarded as architectural masterpieces, his approach was at odds with policies developed by the American Library Association, which pressed for the use of flexible modular shelving for book storage. Happily, Richardson paid no attention to these policies, instead designing monumental book rooms with wooden barrel vault ceilings and stacks arranged in tiered alcoves, as seen in the interior of the Wynne Memorial Library in Woburn, Massachusetts. Note the similarity with the interior of the Norfolk Library, pictured at right. The Wynne Memorial Library was the first in the series, built in 1876, and it established his characteristic plan with a long wing for the stacks connected to reading rooms in the cross axis. A polygonal stair tower rises above, and there is a picture gallery and octagonal museum at the right. The building's vibrant color is achieved through the use of red tile and copper finials on the roof, and the contrast of brownstone with lighter stone trim. The Ames Free Library at Northeaston, Massachusetts, which opened in 1883, is another variation on this theme. It is a simple rectangle in plan, with the stack wing, hall, and reading room lit with bands of windows and stairs in the tower. The facade is of light brown Milford granite with dark reddish-brown Longmeadow brownstone trim, and the roof is red tile. Inside is the familiar stack wing with a wood barrel vaulted ceiling. Note, too, the gargoyle on the eave, similar to the Norfolk Library owl at far right. The Crane Library in Quincy, Massachusetts, built between 1880 and 1882, is almost universally recognized as one of Richardson's greatest works. It was funded by the Crane family as a memorial to Thomas Crane, a wealthy stone contractor who got his start dealing in Quincy granite. Appropriately, the library is constructed of granite, which contrasts with the Longmeadow brownstone trim. Richardson considered this library among his most successful public buildings, achieving the fullest integration of the various elements of the library program in a very simple design: stack wing, hall, reading room, and stairwell, which is no longer in a tower, but in a turret nestled against the building, similar to the one at the Norfolk Library. The interior does not have a barrel vault ceiling, but it is constructed of warm wood, and the balconies have low rails, and there are tall arts and crafts windows with leaded glass. Richardson's 5 libraries were designed in the decade before the Norfolk Library was built. Looking at these libraries, it seems to me that Isabella Eldridge and George Keller were inspired by Richardson's extraordinary body of work. Here we see the long axis and the band of windows lighting the stacks, the cross axis of the Great Hall indicated by the rose window, the use of structural color in the varied materials of the walls, brownstone, fishtail shingles, and the red tile roof. The organic unity of design that Richardson achieved is a theme that would become important to the identity of modern architecture in the 20th century. Mrs. van Rensselaer's description of this organic unity works as well for the Norfolk Library. She wrote, "Each of Richardson's best buildings is an organism, an entity, a coherent, vital whole. We cannot dismember it in thought without hurting both what we leave and what we take away. Every part of a Richardson library is integral to the whole." This is not gilded architecture. It is a monument of what Brendan Gill called Norfolk's golden age of architecture, words memorialized in Grenville Garside's book of the same name. In 1975, coming off the successful attempt to save New York's Grand Central Station from demolition, Gill compiled a list of Norfolk buildings worthy of preservation. He described Norfolk's late 19th and early 20th century architecture as highly imaginative work based not upon reason, but upon romance. This brings me back to our romantic founder, Isabella, who brought fresh flowers to the library daily and personally welcomed patrons. For the library's grand opening on March 6, 1889, Isabella sent engraved invitations to the event, held from 4 o'clock to 8:30 in the evening. She arranged for a program of afternoon and evening music played by George Robinson's Orchestra of New Haven. Coming exactly 1 year after the historic blizzard of March 1888, Isabella probably wondered if snow would postpone the event. The program of music included what must have been popular pieces of the day. Although they may not all be familiar to us, surely you will recognize the waltzes of Emile Waldteufel, a French composer of dance music, whose honeymoon waltz was played in the evening. His greatest hit, Les Patineurs, or The Skater's Waltz, was written in 1882. So listen to this waltz and picture yourself entering the library as it looked on March 6, 1889. You would have passed Isabella's beautiful floral arrangements before walking under wooden fretwork, which spelled the words, "Silence is golden." Of course, it would have been anything but silent on this occasion. You would have passed framed prints mounted on the walls between the stacks and seen tapestries hanging from the balcony rails as you walked toward the alcove in the back. You would have marveled at this glorious building, just as we do today, for it is still largely intact, with the seamless addition of the Great Hall, designed by George Keller in 1911, and the restoration of the terracotta red tile roof in 2015, returning the Norfolk Library to its original design.